Sergeant David Carter had always trusted his instincts. They had kept him alive through countless missions, guiding him through danger like an unseen force. But this time, he wasn't on a battlefield. He was on a quiet morning jog just outside the city limits, where the air was crisp and the scent of pine filled his lungs. Then he heard it. A faint, high-pitched whimper, almost lost in the rustling leaves. He stopped mid-stride, heart pounding. His eyes scanned the dense tree line to his right. Nothing moved, just the wind swaying the branches. Maybe it was his imagination, just a distant echo of some woodland creature. But then there it was again. A desperate, broken cry. David's military training took over. He wasn't the type to ignore a cry for help, no matter who or what needed saving. He stepped off the dirt trail and pushed through the thick underbrush, moving toward the sound. Dry twigs snapped under his boots as he maneuvered through the dense foliage. Then he saw them. 3 tiny German shepherd puppies, no more than a few weeks old, tied to a tree with a length of frayed rope. Their fur was matted with dirt, their ribs showing through their thin coats. One lay completely still, too weak to lift its head. The other 2 shivered violently, their dark eyes wide with fear. David's stomach twisted. Someone had left them here, abandoned them like trash. He crouched low, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle them. "Hey there, little guys," he murmured, his voice softer than usual. One of the puppies let out a weak whimper, trying to stand but collapsing onto its side. David reached for his pocket knife and carefully cut through the rope. The moment the last thread snapped, one of the puppies attempted to crawl toward him, as if sensing he was their only chance at survival. His hands worked fast, scooping up the frail bodies. Their fur was ice-cold against his skin. He could feel their shallow breathing, their tiny hearts beating fast. Whoever had done this had left them to die, but not on his watch. Cradling the 3 helpless pups in his arms, he turned and ran. David's heart pounded as he sprinted back to the trail, the weight of the 3 fragile puppies pressing against his chest. Their tiny bodies trembled in his arms, their fur cold and damp. He could feel their labored breathing. Weak, uneven, desperate. Time was running out. Reaching his truck, he yanked the door open and carefully laid the puppies on the passenger seat, wrapping them in his army green jacket. The fabric swallowed their small bodies, but at least it would keep them warm. The smallest one, barely moving, let out a faint whimper that sent a fresh wave of urgency through him. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He didn't know exactly how long they had been out there, but judging by their condition, they couldn't afford to wait another hour. Slamming the truck into gear, he sped down the winding dirt road, kicking up a trail of dust behind him. His mind raced with questions. Who could have done this? Why would someone leave 3 defenseless puppies tied to a tree? The thought made his jaw clench. He had seen a lot of terrible things in his time as a soldier, but this was pure cruelty. The road ahead blurred as he pushed the speedometer past the limit, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He glanced down at the puppies. The one he feared for the most, the runt of the group, barely twitched beneath his jacket. His chest rose and fell so faintly that David could hardly tell if he was breathing at all. "Hold on, little guy," he muttered, his voice tight. "You're gonna be okay." The town finally came into view, and David took a sharp turn onto the main road, heading straight for the veterinary clinic. He barely registered the curious stares from pedestrians as he pulled up in front of the building, tires screeching. Throwing the truck into park, he grabbed the puppies and rushed inside. The cool air of the clinic hit him as he burst through the doors. A woman in scrubs behind the counter looked up in surprise. "I need help," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. Now, the receptionist's eyes widened when she saw what he was carrying. Within seconds, a vet and 2 assistants appeared, ushering him toward the back. "Where did you find them?" the vet asked as she carefully lifted the smallest puppy from his arms. "Tied to a tree," David said, his voice low but edged with anger. They were barely holding on. The vet's face hardened. "We'll do everything we can." David watched as they carried the puppies away. For the first time in years, he felt completely helpless. David stood frozen in the middle of the clinic, his breathing uneven as he watched the veterinarian and her team disappear behind a set of swinging doors. The moment they were out of sight, an unsettling feeling settled deep in his chest, an unfamiliar kind of helplessness. He had spent years on battlefields where his decisions had meant the difference between life and death. But here, standing in a brightly lit clinic surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptics, there was nothing he could do but wait. He paced the length of the waiting room, his fists clenching and unclenching. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, offered him a seat, but he shook his head. Sitting still felt impossible. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Every time the door swung open, he tensed, expecting an update. But it was always someone else. A woman picking up her tabby cat, an elderly man with a golden retriever. Each time, he fought the urge to storm back there and demand answers. Finally, the door creaked open and the vet stepped out. Her expression was unreadable, sending a fresh wave of anxiety through him. "How are they?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. The vet sighed, wiping her hands on her scrubs. It was close. She gestured for him to follow her, leading him into a small recovery room. His pulse pounded as he stepped inside. The 3 puppies lay nestled in a soft, padded enclosure, each one hooked up to a tiny IV drip. Their frail bodies barely moved, but at least they were breathing. The smallest one, his heart clenched at the sight, looked the worst, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. They were severely dehydrated and malnourished, the vet explained. "Especially this little guy. We're doing everything we can, but," she hesitated, "we need to see if they're strong enough to pull through." David swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What can I do?" The vet offered him a small smile. "For now, just be here. Talk to them. Let them know they're safe." He stepped closer to the enclosure, lowering himself until he was eye level with the tiny fighters. Their fur was cleaner now, their little paws twitching in sleep. Gently he reached through the enclosure, brushing his fingers over the smallest pup's head. "You're not giving up," he murmured. "Not after everything you've been through." The tiny pup let out a barely audible whimper, and for the first time since finding them, David let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They weren't out of the woods yet, but as long as they were fighting, so was he. David sat in the small recovery room, his eyes fixed on the tiny German Shepherd puppies as they lay nestled together. The slow, steady beeping of the monitor was the only sound in the room, marking the fragile rhythm of their survival. He'd been in plenty of life-or-death situations before, but none had felt quite like this. Out there, in the field, he had been trained for combat, for high-pressure decisions. But this, waiting, hoping, watching 3 helpless creatures fight for their lives, this was something else entirely. The vet returned a short while later, checking their IV drips and adjusting their blankets. She glanced at David, her expression softer than before. "They've had a chance," she said. "The fluids are helping, and they're responding well to treatment. But they're going to need around-the-clock care for the next few weeks." David nodded, already knowing what she was about to say. He had spent the last few hours thinking about it. These puppies had no one. If he left them here, they'd be placed in a shelter, maybe even separated. After everything they had been through, he couldn't let that happen. "I'll take them," he said firmly. The vet blinked, as if surprised by his immediate response. "Are you sure? It's a big commitment. They're going to need proper food, medication, and I'm sure." His voice left no room for argument. "Just tell me what they need, and I'll handle it." The vet studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, you'll need special formula to supplement their diet until they regain their strength. I'll put together some supplies for you." As she walked away, David turned back to the tiny fighters. They were still weak, but he could see it now, the flicker of life returning to them. "You're coming home with me," he murmured. "And I promise, no one is ever going to hurt you again." An hour later, David carried a small crate out of the clinic, the puppies bundled inside with soft blankets. As he placed them carefully on the passenger seat of his truck, a thought crossed his mind. He had gone for a morning run expecting just another day. Instead, he had walked straight into a mission he hadn't planned for. But maybe, just maybe, it was the most important one yet. The drive home was unlike any other David had taken. He kept glancing at the crate on the passenger seat, where the three puppies lay curled together in a bundle of soft blankets. Every so often, one of them let out a tiny sigh or twitch, but they were too exhausted to move much. It was a quiet, fragile kind of silence, the kind that made him grip the wheel just a little tighter. He had spent years in the military, where his job had been to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He never expected that mission to follow him home, let alone take the shape of three helpless puppies. But here he was, driving toward an uncertain future with three tiny lives depending on him. When he pulled into his driveway, he shut off the engine and turned to look at them. "Welcome home," he muttered under his breath. Carrying the crate inside, he set it gently down in the living room. His house was simple, minimalist, organized, just as he liked it. But now it was about to become something else, a recovery center for three abandoned souls. One by one, he lifted the puppies from the crate and placed them onto a soft dog bed near the fireplace. They barely stirred, too weak to explore. The smallest one, the one that had worried him the most, let out a weak little sigh before curling against his siblings. David crouched beside them, running a careful hand over their fur. "You're safe now," he murmured. "No more cold nights. No more hunger. No more fear." For the first few days, it was touch and go. He set alarms to wake up every few hours, carefully feeding them with a special syringe and keeping a close eye on their hydration. At night, he slept lightly, listening for any signs of distress. Little by little, they started to improve. Their eyes became more alert. Their tiny legs, once too weak to hold them up, started wobbling as they attempted to stand. The first time the biggest one, a strong-willed pup he had started calling Max, managed to take a few steps toward him, David felt a strange, unexpected warmth in his chest. They were fighters, just like him. One night, as he sat on the couch with the puppies curled against his side, he realized something. He hadn't just saved them, they had given him something too. A new purpose, a reason to keep fighting, even off the battlefield. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Days turned into weeks, and the change in the puppies was nothing short of remarkable. What had once been three frail, silent creatures clinging to life had become energetic balls of fur, tumbling through David's house like they owned the place. Max, the biggest of the three, was fearless. He was the first to find his footing, the first to bark, and the first to demand food by pawing at David's leg. Bella, the only female, was sharp and observant, always watching before making her move. And Rocky was the stubborn one. If David tried to guide him one way, he would sit down and refuse to budge until he got his way. They were strong now, but they needed discipline, and discipline was something David knew well. One morning, as the puppies clambered over each other, nipping playfully at his hands, he made a decision. "All right," he muttered, standing up. "Time to put that energy to use." He led them outside to his backyard, a large enclosed space that was about to become their training ground. At first, they just wagged their tails and stared at him, not understanding what was coming. But David was patient. Training soldiers required persistence. Training puppies, not much different. He started with simple commands: sit, stay, come. Max caught on fast, eager to please. Bella followed, quickly mimicking her brother. Rocky flopped onto his back, tail wagging, waiting for belly rubs. David sighed, but he couldn't help but grin. "You're lucky you're cute," he muttered, scratching Rocky's belly before trying again. Day after day, he worked with them. He used treats, encouragement, and the same steady patience that had once made him a leader among men. Slowly, the puppies learned. They sat when told, waited before eating, and even responded to their names. Their bond with David grew, and for the first time in a long time, his home felt less like a house and more like a family. One evening, as he watched them curled up together on the couch, he realized something. These puppies weren't just learning from him. They were changing him too. For so long, his life had been about survival. Now, it was about something more. And he wouldn't trade it for anything. The morning started like any other. David brewed a strong cup of coffee, stepped outside, and watched as the three German shepherds tore through the backyard, their playful barks echoing in the crisp air. The transformation was incredible. Where there had once been weak, helpless puppies, now stood three strong, intelligent, and fiercely loyal dogs. Max sprinted ahead, his ears perked, always on high alert. Bella weaved behind him, watching his every move with sharp focus. And Rocky, stubborn, determined Rocky, took his time, his tail wagging as he sniffed every inch of the yard before deciding where he wanted to go. David chuckled to himself. They were a handful, but he wouldn't change a thing. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. For a second, he debated ignoring it, but something told him to pick up. "Carter," he answered, his voice still carrying the sharpness of military discipline. "Sergeant Carter, this is Mike Lawson from the K-9 Training Division," the voice on the other end said. "I heard about your rescue and the work you've been doing with those pups." David's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Yeah." Lawson continued, his tone interested. "We worked with service dogs for veterans, particularly those struggling with PTSD, mobility issues, and emotional recovery. I saw a video your vet posted of Max and Bella responding to your commands. That kind of focus and discipline, it's rare in rescues." David glanced at the dogs. They were rough around the edges, sure, but their intelligence and loyalty were undeniable. "What are you asking?" he said cautiously. "I'm asking if you consider bringing them in for an evaluation. With the right training, they could be more than just pets. They could save lives." David's breath caught for a moment. He had rescued them, raised them, and now there was a chance they could go on to help others, people just like him who had walked through hell and back. He looked at the three dogs again, watching as Max sat attentively, waiting for his next command. Bella mirrored him perfectly, her sharp eyes locked on David. Even Rocky, stubborn as ever, was finally sitting still. They had been abandoned once, left for dead. Now, they had a purpose. David nodded, more to himself than to Lawson. "Tell me when and where," he said. This mission wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. A week later, David stood outside the K-9 training center, his three German shepherds by his side. Max, Bella, and Rocky had no idea what was about to happen, but their excitement was obvious. Tails wagging, ears perked, eyes scanning their new surroundings. David, on the other hand, felt something he hadn't in a long time. Purpose. He'd adjusted the leashes in his hands as Mike Lawson approached, a tall man with a confident stance. "Glad you came," Lawson said, giving a nod of approval as he glanced at the dogs. "They look even better in person." David smirked. They've come a long way. Lawson led them toward the training area, a wide open space filled with obstacles, trainers, and working dogs going through exercises. The air was filled with the sharp sound of commands and the steady beat of disciplined movement. "We're going to run them through a few tests," Lawson explained. "Obedience, focus, temperament. Not every dog is cut out for service work, but from what I've seen, they've got potential." David crouched down, looking each of his dogs in the eyes. "All right, team," he murmured. "Time to show them what you've got." The first test was simple, obedience drills. Max was a natural, following every command with unwavering focus. Bella, sharp and precise, responded instantly, mirroring Max's movements. And Rocky, David held his breath as the stubborn one took an extra second before finally obeying. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Next came the distraction test. Trainers walked by with food, toys, even other dogs trying to break their concentration. Max didn't even flinch. Bella hesitated once, but quickly refocused. Rocky? Well, he gave David one look, as if debating his choices, then finally stayed put. David let out a quiet chuckle. "You're learning, huh?" By the end of the evaluation, Lawson nodded, clearly impressed. "They're trainable. More than that, they've got heart. With time, they could be incredible service dogs." David exhaled, feeling something deep inside settle into place. He had rescued them when they were weak and broken, given them a home, a second chance. Now they had the opportunity to change someone else's life, just like they had changed his. Lawson extended his hand. "What do you say, Carter? Ready to train them for something bigger?" David looked at his dogs as family. Max, always alert. Bella, smart and steady. And Rocky, the fighter who never gave up. He shook Lawson's hand firmly. "Yeah," he said. "Let's do this." The puppies he had once found tied to a tree were no longer victims. They were warriors now.